Yes, today I want to present something that's very classroom oriented. It's fairly simple, making some fairly simple points about how this whole issue of reality and literature would work out in the classroom. It leads to a lot more complicated stuff because we've got intertextuality and we've got the actual viewpoint of the reader, the person engaging with the text. So it could become quite complicated, but I'm trying to keep it fairly simple. To start off with, I'd like you to meet the crew, the students themselves that I was teaching on this particular course. There were 16 of them. It was a fairly small group. They're majoring in English literature at Sophia, and they were the second from the top of 5 groups by their TOEFL level. So quite a good group, fairly capable students. And the course itself was designated as a writing workshop, and I chose to teach that as a computer room course. These are not the students, this is just a generic picture of Sophian students working in a call room. And the class was a 90-minute lesson, standard 90-minute lesson over a 1-year period. So the course aims, the syllabus was gambatte. Yeah, okay. To read Jane Eyre in the first term and research Jane Eyre and write a paper about it. So for people who are involved in the EFL world, that might be a big chunk of work to do with a regular bunch of students, but being literature majors, they were well able to do that. And then in the second term, we did Wide Sargasso Sea. There were a variety of activities along with that, like watching movie versions, having a blog for the class so that they could put their discussions up, they could exchange views, recorded discussions using the call room, so that for a writing class, the aim of this class is supposed to be part of their English development, but they tend to speak in Japanese, so one way of getting around that was to actually record the discussions, and then they would, the discussions would take place in English, in groups, of course, and their reaction papers and things like that. So they had a variety of activities to keep them busy. And there was a classroom, a course webpage, which was effectively like a kind of diary, so that I would be putting up every week the things that they've done in the course. Like we looked at Buick's English Birds because that was what Jane's reading at the beginning of the novel, and the odd PowerPoint presentation for them. That one's on Gender, Empire and Madness, homework prints. I mean, basically they could go to that page and they could just get all the materials related to the course. So it's a bit like a sort of focused textbook in a way for the course. Movie versions and things like that. Some little app has decided to open up. Drat. That's got in the way. Excuse me, I shall have to get rid of that because it's going to get in the way for the rest of the presentations. So let me just... And they made their own little presentations as well, although the whole thing has now decided to crash. Okay, they made their own presentations, and one of them was on education, for example. This is just sort of by way of showing you the sort of work that they were doing. So this is using something called Evernote, and they had you know, slide. You can see slides 1 to 5 there. We'll focus in on one of those slides. The third one there, for example. So they'd be writing stuff like this on, you know, various little projects to help them to kind of get a grip on the period and share those kinds of things. So they had plenty to be doing. Yeah, just a little, sorry, I forgot, a little bit more on that. Their email exchanges with me where they'd send me emails, in this case, talking about darkness in Jane Eyre and Bertha being dark and so on, and me responding with some suggestions, and that leading them through to writing their term paper. Okay, the student and my response, and then their term paper, where they're sending me drafts of their work, and I look at their drafts and send them back. And we're all chugging along very nicely. I will, you know, kind of correct their work in that sort of way, and we'll lead. So that something like that would end up, after drafts, would end up in a fairly coherent, in fact, I think a very impressive paragraph from a student. And in fact, out of this class, 16 students, 9 of them got a grade A from me. They rose very well to the occasion and produced very good work. So that's the course, that's the basic sort of syllabus. And I'll just very use the texts, which I think probably Jane Eyre, at least most of you, probably everybody here, has a reasonable sense of what goes on in Jane Eyre. That you know, she goes to work as a governess. She falls in love with Edward Rochester. He asks her to marry him, and she's gobsmacked to learn that he's actually already married to a crazy lady who's locked up in the attic, and that this is the obstacle to their marriage. Basically, Bertha Mason is a plot device in Jane Eyre. And then we move on. Wide Sargasso Sea, written by Jean Rhys, who was herself a Creole, and who was pretty upset, I think. Well, she was. She states that she was very upset by the way that the Creole was represented in Bronte's work. So she sets out to write her own work, in a sense to set the record straight, or at least to open the thing up, the whole topic up to some kind of debate. Bertha, of course, in Jane Eyre never speaks, so Antoinette Crosway is, in a sense, the story of the untold story of Bertha. But therein lies the problem, because that's not really what it is. And that's where students are beginning to kind of come adrift. So Antoinette is growing up in Jamaica. She has a troubled childhood. Her father's died. She and her mother are not accepted by the white community or by the black community. She's taunted by the black children. She's called a white cockroach. And one night, a mob of black people come and burn down her house. So that's the sort of background to Antoinette, who becomes, from being Antoinette Crosway, becomes Antoinette Mason when her mother marries for a second time, and she becomes Bertha because for some reason the Rochester character in Wide Sargasso Sea decides that he likes that name, so he calls her by that name. So the kind of response that we get from students then is that in Jane Eyre, they see Bertha as, the baddie. Okay, the crazy lady who's locked up, and she prevents the good people from having their loving relationship and all of that sort of stuff. And that Rochester is just an unhappy man. He didn't know that he'd married somebody who was going to become mad. And I did not doubt as a student that she was really crazy. And the student goes on to say, however, Rhys questions this setting. She insists that it's natural for Bertha to be mad, thinking about her background. I was really impressed with her perspective that could see things from various ways. I read this book and learned about her hard life. I did not know anything about the position of Creole people, or that she suffered a lot of betrayals, or about her cruel husband. How terrible her life is. All well and good up to a point. There are problems here. The problem is that the student seems to think that what what she's getting from Jean Rhys is the untold story of like a real person, Bertha Mason, and this is her untold story. So the connections between literature and reality are becoming very confused here. And I've had this problem teaching this novel in the past, that the students seem to somehow feel that this is the objective truth now, and that whenever they read Jane Eyre, they have to imagine that Jane Eyre's childhood was that experience of Antoinette Cosway in Wide Sargasso Sea. How do I get them out of this mindset? How do I get them beyond that into seeing that it's just a perspective, it's just a way of looking at it. It's not as clear-cut as they're trying to see it. It's complicated than that. So on this occasion, I opened it up by saying, look, whatever we may or may not know about Bertha Mason in Jane Eyre, there's one thing that we can be sure of. There's supposed to be volume coming out there, but it's only coming out from my tiny little thing here. So we're missing out on that aspect, though it doesn't really matter particularly. What is this thing that we can be sure of? We can be sure that whatever Bertha Mason is or is not, she was not Antoinette Cosway. And so that leaves the students with a job to do. Why can I say that? How can I be so sure about that? Okay, so they've got their computer. They're there in the call room. All they've got to do is, go in, Google it up, see what they can find out. So Jane Eyre timeline seemed like a good way to, the ones who sort of started thinking, let's look at the timeline. They were the ones who tended to get there quicker. And the third timeline that comes up there, this Enthusiast's Guide to Jane Eyre, is a very, very full timeline. So we'll just go through, pick out some of the main details. So it tells us when Bertha Antoinetta Mason is born in Jane Eyre, 1787. And Rochester himself, he's 2 or 3 years younger than she is, in 1790. And Jane Eyre in 1810, she's considerably younger. And in 1818, Bertha Mason is diagnosed insane. Now the novel starts to sort of heat up, and the main action is taking place in late 1828 and early 1829 and moving on into 1830. This is when Rochester and Jane are falling in love. And the story kind of winds itself up. This is still this is 1830. Mrs. Reed, so that's the summer of 1829, and that's when Rochester proposes. So by 1832, in June, finally they get married, and the story's all wound up with actually Jane writing her autobiography. It's fiction, obviously, it's Bronte that writes it. That's happening in 1840. So they get that far, but where does that get us? Where does that get them? Okay. Bertha Mason was born in or around 1787. She'd have been in her 30s at the time, but Rochester was hitting on Jane. So they need to find out a little bit more. They need to compare the texts, the timeline for Wide Sargasso Sea. we can get nothing like such a detailed timeline for White-Sagasse OC. In fact, we hardly know anything in terms of dates. Very little is being told to us. We certainly couldn't produce something as exact as we can for Jane Eyre. And of course, there's the actual history, what was going on in the world at that time. That's where we're obviously connecting with reality. So that's where the goods obviously come in. That's where we get the discovery. By checking a similar timeline for White-Sagasse OC, actually noticing in one case, we're being told that the timeline has been changed from the timeline of Jane Eyre. And that really is what leads to the kind of answer to all of this. Just take a look in a little bit more detail there. There's something called Esther's narrative. Of course, when they're doing their actual research for their papers, they'll be looking at academic papers, but for the sake of getting basic background information, going to websites like this is very helpful. They find out that the timeline has been changed and the story is taking place after the Emancipation Act of 1833. So slavery wasn't abolished until 1833, and by that time, Bertha Mason in Jane Eyre was already dead. And there's no way that black people would have been in a position to call her a white cockroach or burn her house down, because they would have been slaves. They'd have been whipped, they'd have been put to death. There was no way that that was going to happen. So they now are able to confirm what I've told them, that the childhood of Bertha Mason, whatever it might have been like, could not have been the childhood of Antoinette Cosway. So it's a very simple process of just cross-checking with reality. But something that students very often just don't do. You get them talking about the Victorian period, like women were not able to have their own possessions in the Victorian period once they were married. No, that's not right. Okay, well, what about Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich? Well, that's pre-Victorian. I mean, how does she get to be rich? Okay, women could have property under certain circumstances, and the law was constantly changing through that period. So knowing the historical reality and connecting it with the text is crucial to understanding what's going on in the Victorian or any other period. You have to tie novels to their historical context. Okay, so there you go. All right. Yeah, I'm sorry that the sound's not coming out. It would. Yeah. The sound should be coming out through here. I don't know why it isn't, but anyway, it doesn't really matter all that much. So then let's move on to Antoinette's madness. Where does it come from? Does she get it from her parents? Is it the environment that changes her? That's what a student asks. And what I'm trying to do is to say, look, I understand your curiosity about that, but I don't want to come down too heavily on you or anything, but that is really the wrong question, or it's the wrong way to ask the question. Or at least you've got to understand that the answer is not going to be what you think it's going to be from the way that you framed the question. So let's take a look at a more sophisticated response from a student. As I read White-Sagasse OC, which is a novel based on another novel, I felt like finding what's the truth in the story, but there is no truth because the author makes the story. Okay, beginning to get there. I'm trying to find out not the truth, but the purpose, why the author wrote this, or what it is the author wants to tell us. Why does the time frame change? Okay, what's going on? I mean, she had a perfect chance. She could have made it, so that would have been a possible childhood for Bertha Mason. She chose not to. She obviously had a different agenda. What was that agenda? What might it have been? Great, a good question to ask. So when I asked them about Antoinette's mother on the blog, why does Antoinette's mother go mad? Look at the answers. She went mad mostly because of her son. She becomes mad because her son and her parrot died. Somehow, I know, isn't that funny? She loses important things like her horse and Pierre. The death of her horse, her parrot, and her son. Well, presumably not in any particular order of priority there. Death of intimate person or animal such as Pierre. So the basic point is that nobody is actually thinking that it's hereditary. They're not saying that it's a genetic madness. So presumably, we can infer that Jean Rhys is not trying to say that it's a genetic, or is opening up the idea that it's not a genetic madness, but it's not as clear-cut as saying that it definitely isn't. She inherits some of her nature from her mother, and they both suffer the same extreme circumstances. In other words, you've got a little bit of both going on. So it's not as simple as either or. Rhys is inviting her readers to look at things in a more nuanced kind of way. So I won't go on for very much longer. The madness comes from, at first the student said, I thought the madness in Antoinette comes from her mother. However, when I read the scene where Mr. Rochester makes love to one of the servants, I came to think that her terrible marriage also causes her to go mad. So the also there indicating, well, it's partly her temperament, which is going to be genetic or to an extent inherited from her family genes, but it's also circumstances that have triggered things. So they're now starting to talk in a much more nuanced kind of way. That Rochester, to an extent, is responsible for her becoming mad. And the same way as her mother became mad because of the actions of her husband. We've got, could she have avoided becoming mad? She had the example of her mother. She knew what she did. She knew how to, she, in theory, knew what she had to avoid, but she didn't manage to do it. We've got the question of whether she's mad at all. Okay, one student saying, well, I didn't actually think necessarily she was mad until this episode of biting, which is in both novels, and that she, in Why Sargasso Sea, she doesn't remember having done it. So Jean Rhys is not, for this student at least, querying whether Antoinette is or is not mad, or has not been driven mad at this stage. But the question of why that happened, how that happened, is very much in the student's mind. So we are getting a more nuanced understanding that the madness is for at least two reasons and possibly a multiplicity of reasons, partly genetic and partly due to the environment. And the final, most insightful understanding from one student, commenting on the blog, while there may be wrong answers, okay, Bertha Mason's childhood could not have been that of Antoinette Cosway, there can be more than one right answer. And that's what makes it interesting. That's what makes it, gives it its point. So that's where I'm ending up. Thank you very much for listening to me today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So,